great to have you here. So today we're here talking more about Dexter, and I wanted to do a tier list of the seasons of Dexter and ranking them. I haven't done a tier list on the channel or really done a tier list at all for the most part in the past, so thought this would be a new creative way to talk more about Dexter. At one point I debated going back and watching all the seasons again. I've watched all of the original seasons numerous times. It's been a little bit since I've watched them though. The last time I watched the show in its entirety was shortly before New Blood, so it's been a few years. A little bit of this I'm relying on just memory and so forth, but as I was saying, I debated doing a video scoring each season individually, giving a review of it, and ultimately something out of 10 as far as a score. I may do that in the future. For now, I just want to do a tier list, just ranking each of the seasons combined. As I said, it's been a few years, so bear with me a little bit in talking about each of these. I'll get into a little bit detail on each of the seasons, but understanding that you probably have watched these, so it's more me talking about points that you're probably well aware of at this point and just giving my own input and context on each of those. So I have a little bit different descriptors for each of the tier lists. So we have at the very top, we have Killed It, which is pretty much your S tier territory where it's just the very best of the best. Then we have Bloody Good Time, think of that as your A tier. Still Alive is roughly your B tier or in the middle of things. Backstabbed is our C or D tier. And then On His Table, we're calling F tier. So a little bit Dexter themed for the descriptors, thought that'd be fun. And I just want to point out too, a lot of these are stretching it out, trying to make sure that we put seasons in certain categories. So if I'm being honest, most people have the belief that the first 4 seasons of Dexter are peak Dexter, and I would generally agree with that. I would put them all very highly rated. Think of this as being almost like you're zooming into a video clip of something, you're stretching it out, so it's really finally looking in what's differentiating each of those seasons, because I would probably, more often than not, seasons 1 through 4 are, I don't know if they're always going to be S tier for me, but they're very highly regarded. So I'm a little bit going in depth as far as finding things to give a little bit of separation on each of those. And I do want to point out too, this is my personal preference for each of the seasons. You may have your own. These aren't the ones that I'm saying these are the very best in this order, but as far as what I enjoy at this point in time, this is how I would rank them. Let me know down in the comments below your thoughts on each of these tiers. How would you rank them? Also, for a question of the day, if you want to include, if you want to list your favorite Dexter character, probably say non-Dexter Dexter character. So somebody other than Dexter, who's your favorite character from the show? Would love to hear that, as well as your opinion on how you would tier each of these seasons. As I said, my personal opinions, hopefully everyone respects that and is civil down in the comments. Some of these may be a little bit of hot takes or unique from what people think, but I'm just gonna give my own viewpoint on things and see what you guys think there as well. So starting things off, in these images, should be in the correct order, but some of them are a little bit harder to tell which season I'm referring to. So season 1, so the beginning of Dexter. As far as, I'll list some pros and cons of each. I won't go full detail on what the entirety of the season entails. Maybe in the future I'll do reviews of each season, but for now we're sticking high level bullet points, things that stood out to me. Not as much the side storylines, I would say. So more so big heavy points as well as things that stuck out for the most part. So as far as pros for season 1, I would say it was a new concept. So it's based off the books. Other than the very first book and the very first season, they stray far from each other. So the first book, and I'm not going to put any spoilers because most people have probably seen the show, they probably haven't read the books. I encourage you to take a look. I don't think the books are as strong as the show, even though it's the source material, and I think a lot of people probably share that opinion that the show is kind of more their style. But I would say the first season and the first book, there's a lot of overlap with the plot. You have a similar situation with Brian Moser and so forth. But they end the book and the end season 1 differently, and those have big impacts as far as going forward. And then the books do not really tie into the show at all when it comes to the direction they go, what characters live, what characters die, so forth. So I encourage you to check both of them out just because they're a little bit different, and if you like one, you'll at least enjoy the subject material of the other one. Going back to the pros, we have a new concept. I enjoyed the ice truck killer twist. This is really the only season I can think of that we don't know who the big bad is for a majority of the season. So we know there's somebody who is playing with Dexter, knows who he is, and is trying to get under his skin and kind of mess around with crime scenes and so forth to send him little messages. And as I said, most of the season we don't know who the killer is, and I think that's an interesting aspect. I'm glad they kind of do a little bit of both, where they focus on a character for the duration of the season versus this situation where for the first few episodes, Brian Moser or Rudy's not even in it, and then we get the reveal, oh, he's the doctor who's then dating Deb, and he's doing that to get close to Dexter. So that was an interesting twist to include there. We also first get to know the Miami Metro in this first season, so we have Angel, Masuka, Dokes, LaGuerta, Deb, so forth. It's really just getting to know that team and the backstory there. We also have the inclusion of James Remar, so that was something that was not, as far as I remember, that was not in the books. So you have Dexter's father, or foster father. He's the ghostly person talking to Dexter. He's almost Dexter's conscience, and just giving him a perspective on things. If he's thinking about how to proceed with a certain situation, you'll have James Remar pop up and they'll have a little bit of back and forth, and that's a really great aspect of the show that they chose to add, so major kudos there. As far as any cons, I would say that since this was somewhat of the first episode's a pilot, and then from there you have the first season, which you don't have the actors fully in their character form, so it takes time for them to flesh out what's my character going to be like. And so I would say similar to when you had the British Office and then The Office, you had Michael Scott, or Steve Carell, who very much acted like the Michael Scott version of the British Office, and he had that British humor where it's very rude and so forth with his slick back hair. And it wasn't until season 2 he changed to being kind of the lovable. He still was mean, but he did it in a lighthearted or fun kind of way. So I feel like Steve Carell, that's an example of he created his version of that character. Similarly here, the first couple episodes, we don't know who these characters are. They're still figuring out who they are. So that's going to be a challenge anytime you have a first season of a new show. I feel like they more so follow the book as far as how the characters act and so forth. So obviously this situation, you don't even have a show you're comparing it to. You have a book you're comparing the show to. So bit of a different situation. I would say another con would be it's a little slower paced. A lot of these are just going to be unfortunate outcomes of being the first season of something. You have to get the backstory. You have to get to know the characters. You have to get fully invested. And a lot of the flashbacks I don't necessarily care for. They obviously provide depth as far as who Dexter is and what his backstory is and why he does what he does. So it provides value to the show, but it's not necessarily something I'm wanting to watch, especially on repeated views, I would say. This is one that maybe after watching the show a few times, it drops a little bit in my perception of things. And then also I'm thinking of, you have Paul, who's Rita's ex. That's a story obviously that's included there where you have Dexter trying to maneuver that and support Rita, and that's not a very interesting side story in my opinion. I don't care for Paul as a character, and I know you're not supposed to, but that whole inclusion of how Dexter maneuvers around getting Paul out of the picture, not something I really needed. So I would say some of the side plots in season 1 are not necessarily my favorites. If I was putting this on the tier list, and I have my tablet over here, so I'm just moving from the bottom up to the tiers, we'll put season 1, we'll put it in Bloody Good Time. I know a lot of people may be offended by that and think season 1 is an S tier, killed it. And as I said, if I was viewing this show compared to other shows, I would probably put it there. But because we're looking at such a tight lens of Dexter season specifically, to provide some sort of separation between seasons, I'm going to put this in Bloody Good Time. And I will point out too, this can change over time. I'll point some of these out later, but I fully believe some of these seasons I viewed differently upon first watch, and at this point I have different views on how I think of them and which ones I like more or less than others. Jumping into season 2, so season 2 is almost like an extension of season 1, so it builds on the story. You don't necessarily get a big bad like you do in typical Dexter seasons. You have the Bay Harbor Butcher, which is more or less the big bad. I don't know if you want to call Lila or Dokes a big bad, but the Bay Harbor Butcher is the primary storyline here. And as far as pros, I would say that is certainly a pro. You have Dexter, who is being essentially hunted at this point by all across the country. People are hearing the story. You have the FBI coming in and so forth. And the inclusion of Frank Lundy is also something I would say is a big pro. He's a great inclusion to the show. He's kind of a quirky but very intelligent investigator who's trying to figure out what took place here, who are the Bay Harbor Butchers and so forth. Final pro I'll say is Dokes in this season. So that's kind of one of the negatives to the show in general, I would say, is that Dokes' time on the show is really cut short. He's an interesting character to include. I feel like they got him too close to the fire too early. Maybe they weren't sure how long the show was going to last for, so they chose to go with this during season 2. But as most of you know who've watched the show, Dokes ultimately meets his demise in season 2. But he was a great inclusion. It was fun. He ultimately finds out who Dexter is, and then they have their altercation on the dock, and then ultimately Dokes gets captured and put in the cage. Their banter back and forth when he's in that cage is enjoyable to see. I feel like Dokes gets to understand Dexter a little bit more. Maybe he's playing a game with him to try to get out, but he definitely... Historically, Dokes is just criticizing Dexter, thinking he's just a psycho and so forth, and you have Dexter who... He's more sympathetic towards him when he's in the cage, and as maybe he's playing a game, but their back and forth is super interesting to watch. You also have them when they're in Miami Metro as well, just having their back and forth and just playing games with each other. That's super enjoyable to watch, I would say. Cons, I would point out, one I already mentioned, you have Dokes leave the show too quickly, so he was a very strong character to include in the Dexter series, and in the books he was great too. You have him ultimately meet his demise in this season, so he's gone. So I would say that's, while it made sense in the context of the story where you have the Bay Harbor Butcher and he finds him out and so forth, maybe the Bay Harbor Butcher would have been, in retrospect, a better inclusion to the show a couple seasons later. But you never can perfectly predict what makes sense. So, but I would say him leaving the show, that really I would view as a con. The other one would be Lila. I don't know why so many people really enjoy her character inclusion, but I feel like she's just frequently super annoying whenever she's in the show, and she's just super manipulative. I'm not sure how she really gets her way so many times when it comes to some of these characters. Obviously, it's the point of the plot to develop, but whenever she's on screen with Dexter, I just feel like she's very irritating, and I'm glad she met her demise as well at the end of season 2, and I probably don't like her as much too because she's the reason Dokes is gone. I know she was trying to defend Dexter in the instance, but Lila is a character from beginning to when she tries to screw over Angel, to when she tries to burn down, jeopardize the kids. It just feels like a whole nightmare situation. That adds a little bit of complexity to his relationship with Rita too. That I didn't think about this, but him having the riff with Rita, with Lila, while it makes sense logically to have that take place, it's not something that you're watching Dexter to participate in. Like, I'm not watching Dexter to see the drama between him and his girlfriends necessarily. So that's just my opinion. But overall, the Bay Harbor Butcher portion of things was incredible. Lundy and Dokes were great in the season as well. The drama and tension of, is Dexter gonna get caught? Oh, he did get caught, how is he gonna get out of this? That really ramps up here. So we didn't have that as much in season 1. Obviously, the show's getting started. It's about the ice truck killer. It's about him figuring out who this is and so forth. This is really when it ramps up. Oh, Dexter could get caught. How does he navigate around that? And as I said, I think the drama of this one is very high. So I would say similar to season 1, since it is somewhat of an extension, I'm gonna put this in Bloody Good Time as well. I'll put it slightly in front of season 1. I'll say that they're both very similar, but on rewatch, if I'm gonna wanna watch one again, Bay Harbor Butcher is something that I'm more enticed by, just because of probably, you watch the Ice Truck Killer, it's still enjoyable to watch, but you know it's Rudy, so some of that allure is gone, and the tension with Bay Harbor Butcher feels like it's still great to watch. You still get Dokes in his prime, so a lot of that still, I think, has longevity after one watch, I would call. So both very close, but I'm gonna put 2 over 1. Next up, maybe, in some people's opinion, the biggest controversy of my list.
Surprise,
As I pointed out, this is my personal favorites. This isn't what I would view as the best. If I was giving best, I would rate these differently. But season 3 is probably my favorite season of Dexter. This is one that whenever I see people put rankings of Dexter seasons, this is one they put pretty low. I feel like they have 1, 2, and 4 up in S tier, then 3 will be thrown down there in like C tier. And I personally don't get it. There's a lot of parts where I can see, okay, if you don't like this, but that doesn't bother me as much. So the biggest pro of the entire season is Miguel Prado. So Dexter's relationship with Miguel is so enjoyable to watch. It's him trying to figure out, oh, is this somebody that could be my friend? and how that develops. They have a few episodes of really having that bond. Dexter's used to doing what he does, but the downfall really takes place when Miguel, he's not used to doing this, so he tries to push things too far and Dexter's not comfortable with it. And that eventually gives a rift between them. And obviously what happens to Miguel, but I just enjoy Jimmy Smith's performance as Miguel Prado and just their relationship of whenever they're both on screen, it's super enjoyable to me. You have the inclusion of Quinn here for the first time, so while he's probably not the best in season 3, here's where he's introduced, so that inclusion is great. And overall in season 3, this is the last season where Dexter is not tied down by his family. As mentioned with other parts of the show, there's realistic aspects of life that you're going to include in there, but it's not necessarily enjoyable to watch. Dexter's family life is a realistic obstacle that he has to work around, but it's not something that I don't love seeing that. Honestly, in the later seasons when he eventually just dumps like Jamie with his kid and does his thing, while it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to just do that all the time, it's preferable in my opinion just because we're not watching Dexter to see how he is as a father necessarily. I mean, some of that's true, but I don't need to watch 15, 20 minutes of him trying to figure out who's going to babysit today. That's a reality of the situation, but it's not something that's super fun to watch. Anton's okay in the season. He's all right. He's the one, he winds up dating Deb. He's a victim of the Skinner ultimately, and Deb gets close to him. He's an okay inclusion. He's not the best, not the worst, I would say. You also have Freebo. The beginning of the show starts off with Dexter going after Freebo and accidentally killing one of Miguel's brothers, and that's kind of how things kick off. You have Dexter approach Freebo and takes him out, and then Miguel, that's when they meet up essentially at night, and Miguel and Dexter see each other, and they have the classic scene of Miguel gave Dexter the shirt that had Freebo's blood on it as somewhat of a trust pact, saying, hey, we're good, don't worry. I know you killed Freebo, but here's my shirt that incriminates myself as being part of the crime too, because it's my shirt, it's got his blood on it. We're both in this together. And then you get later in the season, Dexter finds out, I think it's cow's blood or something like that, and he gets so frustrated and winds up giving it back to Miguel. He plays around with Miguel later in the season, which is enjoyable to watch. I like their friendship, but it's still enjoyable to see their rivalry develop as well later in the season, and Dexter really just gets the one up on Miguel every time, and seeing Miguel get so frustrated is awesome. You have Dexter being like, I thought that would come out, when he has the he says he puts in his dry cleaning, he puts a little dry cleaning slip in Miguel's house, and he winds up going to pick it up and he sees the shirt with the blood on it. So he plays games with him, and it's enjoyable to watch that. As far as cons, I would say the ending with Miguel, it slows down a bit, so some of the drama, it just kind of ends at one point. You know, Dexter catches Miguel and takes him out. That happens a lot with these seasons. I feel like you have episode 11 or 12, it kind of just wraps up because you realize the big bad for the season has to go away at this point. So I would say they probably could have had a better ending for Miguel other than just their interaction and then Dexter taking him out. And I think the big criticism of the season typically is the Skinner being the main villain of the season, but honestly, I don't even view him as the big bad. I think Miguel is the big bad. The Skinner, while he's the plot in the background for the entirety of the show as far as who's doing this, he obviously catches Anton and so forth, that's going on, and it gets wrapped up in the last episode, obviously, but I view just the combination of Miguel and the Skinner, and honestly, I watched season 3 for Miguel. The Skinner is okay. I feel like people give it a little too much flack, but you have the guy who's trimming trees, ultimately taking people out, and it's not the best story, but it doesn't need to be because I think the relationship with Miguel is just that great in my opinion. And as I said, this is my personal preference, and upon the rewatch last time, that's when it really ramped up. I knew I liked the season aspects a little bit, but last time I watched the season, it really rose for me. Maybe that'll change in the future, but for now, I'm gonna put season 3 in Killed It, the very top S tier. So that's where I have that one. Jumping into season 4. So season 4 typically is the one that people say, this is the pinnacle of Dexter. This is the best season. After season 4, you don't need to watch. That's always the kind of criticism is, oh, there's 8 seasons plus New Blood, so just watch seasons 1 through 4 and stop there. But you don't want to, you want to keep watching. But either way, season 4 is frequently viewed as the best season of Dexter, and it's hard to argue against that. You have Trinity John Lithgow, who is probably the most iconic big bad of Dexter. You have Lundy come back, unfortunately meets his demise. You have Christine, John Lithgow's daughter in the show. Extra aspect as well with Quinn and the twist there of her being a reporter but being related to Trinity as well. And I mean, this season definitely John Lithgow carries it all the way. He's an interesting villain. He has a unique backstory with his cycle of killing that takes place. And as mentioned, you have Lundy come back. Ultimately, Christine takes out Lundy, so that's an unfortunate aspect of things. As far as villains, it's hard to argue against Trinity being the iconic #1 villain of Dexter just because of how impactful it was at the time. And the most popular scene, in my opinion, of Dexter, other than Dokes' surprise as well, but you have John Lithgow walking into Miami Metro and looking at Dexter's badge as Dexter walks out to meet him and just says, "Hello, Dexter Morgan," and the episode ends. That is one of the top tier, not only moments of Dexter, I feel like of all TV shows, just because it's such a impactful. You have this built up villain who has just been terrorizing through the entirety of the season, and he's gotten to know Dexter, who's playing, I think it's Kyle Butler's his secret name, that he hangs out with Trinity under that persona. Eventually Trinity figures out who he is, goes to Miami Metro. It just becomes such a suspense builder from there because you're like, oh, he is now in jeopardy, his family's in jeopardy and so forth. It's just a great season ultimately. You have the Thanksgiving scene where Dexter's with Trinity's family and you see Dexter grab Trinity and he's about to take him out and his family comes in and sees him, and great TV, I would say, overall. You have some instances where Dexter could kill Trinity but chooses not to, so obviously he winds up regretting those decisions at some point. If I'm pointing out cons, I would say this isn't necessarily a con for me, but it's a con I could see people point out, is that this season is much darker than other seasons. Obviously you're dealing with people dying in all of Dexter, but when it comes to Trinity and the scenes where it's involving just him and his victim, it gets pretty dark. Like you have him kidnap kids, you have him in a bathtub with somebody taking them out, so they get a little bit more close to showing the evil that is some of these people that Dexter kills. I would say, I don't know if that's, as I said, that's not necessarily a con for me, but I could see people being a little bit turned off by that. I would say also, not to put this lightly, but the ending to season 4 is one of the best endings and twists in TV shows, I would call as well. However, upon rewatch, you expect it to happen, so it loses some of that impact. Obviously, it's still a big situation where you have Dexter thinking he won and took out Trinity and then realizes what happened to Rita at the end. That's a huge part of the show. It was a great ending, but after watching it a few times, you're expecting it, so it's not the big surprise anymore. And I would say one criticism, not of this season, but this season kind of bears the brunt of it, is that the show does kind of fall off a little bit afterwards. So while this season is top tier, it's kind of the last time it is top tier, so that impacts things a little bit. As pointed out, if I was grading based off which season is the best, this season would likely be the best. But I'm grading on what is my personal favorite, and I thought this was my favorite previously, but upon my last rewatch, season 3 was higher than season 4 for me. So I'm gonna put season 4 killed it in S tier, but behind season 3. And I know a lot of people are gonna be surprised or irritated by that, so apologize for that, but just my viewpoint. Miguel's relationship with Dexter is something that I thought was awesome in the show, and it's tough to beat Trinity, but having a less dark, more relatable, jovial Dexter with somebody and then him playing games with somebody was something I really enjoyed. So both are gonna be in S tier. As mentioned, if I'm being honest, all of these 1 through 4, if I was comparing it to other shows, would be at the top, but for the sake of trying to differentiate as much as possible, season 3 and 4 are gonna be in Killed It, and 2 and 1 in Bloody Good Time. So now we get to season 5, and as I said, this is where people say the show drops off, and I will say it drops off a little bit. I think people overrate how much a cliff it falls off on. I still enjoyed season 5. So you have him, it pretty much just picks up from season 4. So typically other seasons have had season end and then time passes and then you pick up with the next one. Like season 3, for example, ended with Dexter with Rita getting married, and he picked up in season 4 where he's got a kid and so forth. So there's typically a time pass, and I'm glad they chose to do this, but season 5 picks up right smack at the end of season 4 where you have Dexter on the floor with his kid and Rita in the bathtub bloody. Obviously recreating Trinity's situation and somewhat recreating how Dexter came about as well in the shipping container. Season 5, as far as pros, I would say the secondary villains in the show were decent. You had Boyd Fowler, who's kind of the first one who's picking up animals, and Dexter ultimately figures out the Barrel Girl situation there. So the mini bosses like that and a few of the other ones as well are decent enough. It's really the one time that comes to mind that Dexter has other villains tied to the main villain that are the main purpose of the season. So you have Jordan Chase, who's kind of the big bad running this Barrel Girl empire, and he has various folks helping him along the way, Boyd Fowler being one of them, who Dexter has an interesting interaction with him. And then you have other, as mentioned, villains, a part of Jordan Chase's situation. There's a really funny one where he has a saran wrap situation where he's with Lumen, who's the main female protagonist of this season. And she was one of the Barrel Girls, and ultimately he is trying to help her, and she's reluctant to it at first and so forth, which makes sense. But they have a situation where they take out one of the guys and they wrap them in saran wrap, and there's like 2 guys dead on the ground, and the Miami Metro is showing up, and they ultimately leave and stage it to look like there was a lot of crazy stuff that was going on between the 2 people, which obviously was fake. But you get Masuka doing like this reenactment of what took place, which is just absurd, but so funny to watch. Jordan Chase overall is interesting. It's not as great as some interactions that Dexter has with the villains, but you have him getting close to him and trying to figure out what's going on and so forth. You have Liddy getting close to Dexter. Liddy getting close, like there's scenes where Liddy gets close to Dexter at the end that are interesting because there's a lot of tension there because he's caught and he has to figure out how to get out of it. Like when he's in the van and ultimately Liddy dies, that's great. Other parts of Liddy in the season, I don't care for. Liddy is a character, once again, I don't think you're supposed to like him, but he comes across as a little creepy and not really enjoyable to watch on screen. Him and Quinn have a bit of an interesting dynamic. Other cons I would point out is the Lumen story gets a little bit old. Obviously, she's gone through trauma, so it makes sense that she's still dealing with it, but it gets a little repetitive. You have complications with the kids as well, so you start off with Dexter being a little bit delirious as far as having to do all this stuff, taking care of the kids and so forth, and just coming to terms with Rita's death. You have the ending with Deb, I would say is probably one of the bigger cons, is that you have her show up to where Lumen and Dexter are taking out Jordan Chase, and there's a screen between them, and Deb shows up and she's just talking and chooses not to engage, but she's like telling them like, hey, get out of here. I will take care of this as soon as you leave. And that would have been the perfect time to have Deb find out who Dexter is, because she was understanding. She realized there was a Barrel Girl who was involved in this, and it would have been a great time for her to then catch Dexter and be like, okay, it's messed up what you're doing, but I get it, because she was saying she got it, but then chose to not engage so that he doesn't get caught, and we drag this out longer, which I don't think worked out in the end. I think you could have had him get caught here by her and do something more interesting going forward. And that's really it for season 5. So season 5 is somewhat of a middle of the road season, as I don't think it's as bad as some people think. I think because it came after season 4, that's tough to live up to that expectation. If I'm ranking this one, I'm going to put this in Still Alive. So it's below the first 4, but it's right after that, I would say. And then season 6, which people may have their different opinions on this, I don't know, but season 6 originally was one of my least favorites. If I'm looking for any positives in that season, you had Mos Def, who I think his name is like Yassine Bey now or something like that, but he was Mos Def at the time. He was a great inclusion, but you killed him off after a couple episodes. I realized he was a celebrity appearance, so you probably had to do that, but he was one of the few bright spots of the season. Mike Anderson, the inclusion there from the Miami Metro, he was okay. He didn't have a lot of personality, but he provided a new approach to the Miami Metro and different personality there, more of that stoic and straight to the point type personality. And you had the episode with Brian Moser as well, where Dexter's like pretending he's there and they're out shooting guns in the car, which it's a little wacky, but it's cool to see the ice truck killer back as well. and you have Trinity's kid that makes an appearance there too. That's about it as far as pros I can think of, because honestly, this season was my least favorite season for a while, and it definitely is not great in my opinion. So as far as the cons, you have the whole religious aspect, which is fine. I don't mind putting that in a show, but it's pretty boring how they do it. I'm not invested in any of the religious cultist storyline at all. Mainly because maybe this isn't like the theme, that's not a theme of the show, so you're just kind of pigeonholing that as a thing to talk about, and it's okay, I guess. Honestly, it feels like some of the times, I don't know how you wouldn't get caught. Like, you have the horses going down the street of Miami and just body parts attached to it. How did nobody see that? I don't know. But overall, just the whole religious plot behind the villain, I didn't buy into it. It's not something I enjoyed. The twist also, it's hard to say upon first watch because I don't entirely remember, but the twist wasn't overly surprising. They've done it in other shows and movies before. You have two big bads. So you have Edward James Olmos as the teacher, and you have Colin Hanks as the protege. You wind up finding out that Edward James Olmos has been dead the whole time. He's in a freezer, and Colin Hanks is really the big bad. It's a big surprise because they're always talking to each other, but they were only ever talking to each other, not to other people. Colin Hanks is the only one who ever talked to Dexter or other people directly, so some of it, even if you couldn't predict it, it wasn't that interesting to me, I would say. So regardless of how expected it was, the rest of the show wasn't working as well, so I didn't love the whole situation. And no disrespect to Colin Hanks, but when we found out he was the big bad, he wasn't that intimidating of a big bad. He just felt very mediocre as far as the main villain of the season. You obviously get him kidnapping Dexter's kid, which there's some predicament there, but even then, like, he was not somebody who I was interested in seeing as a villain. He did not have the Trinity aspects of like the pure evil, and he didn't have the Miguel fun aspects as well. He didn't provide a whole lot to me, and part of that was probably the subject matter, as I mentioned, of having him be a religious cult person where he's predicting the end of the world and trying to cause the end of the world. It wasn't that great in my opinion. It just overall was pretty anticlimactic until the end of the show. So you have him ultimately take out Colin Hanks, and Deb shows up in the church. So if you didn't have Deb show up, the rest of the season the last few episodes would have been super boring. The only thing that makes it kind of interesting is that you have Deb show up, and then you have to wait another year to find out how she gonna react, because she just shows up and sees him, and that's pretty much it. As I mentioned, season 6 for the longest time was my least favorite, and we'll see how the rest of the list goes, but for now, I'm putting this on his table. This is not a season I enjoy, and I'll rewatch it if I'm rewatching the whole series, but I'm not gonna watch this season independently just because I find it super boring and not overly interesting as far as any of the characters or the plot lines or really anything. As mentioned, Dexter's always great, and Mos Def was an interesting side character, but that's about it for me. And then season 7. So this is one that a lot of people place pretty high up there. I feel like it gets a lot of respect as far as the back tier of the seasons, and I think for good reason. So you have Isaac Serco, who's played by Ray Stevenson. I think he's one of the better villains of the show in its entirety. Obviously not necessarily to the Trinity level, but he has a lot of depth to him as far as a character. So he comes across as this vicious, just murderer, and there's scenes where he does that, where he's pretty much dead to rights in a bar, and you find out later he killed like 5 guys and got out of it. So he has that really tough, just gritty villain aspect to him. But then there's scenes where he's talking with Dexter in the bar later too, and find out some of his deeper stories to why he's so frustrated because Dexter killed his lover at the beginning, and that allowed a lot more depth to the character. And I feel like Isaac Serco's ending was a good one. As mentioned previously, you had characters that I really enjoyed like Miguel, but it feels like the end was just kind of like eh. But Isaac's ending I felt like was powerful, and maybe it's because Dexter ultimately didn't kill him. He just wound up passing, and they were friends. I think he even mentioned something in another life we could have been friends. So Isaac Serco really carried season 7. He is the reason season 7 is as high as it is, and I think, as I said, that a lot of people probably put him as a pretty respectable villain and like this season compared to some of the later ones because of him. As far as other pros, I think some can be pros, can be cons. The whole Hannah McKay storyline I think was strong at first. The drama with Deb was interesting at first because you have how's she going to handle this, what's going to happen. Both of those kind of drag on a little bit too much and they bleed into season 8, which is some of the problems with season 8. But the drama with Deb, it feels like it gets old. It's like, okay, I get it. Realistically, you probably would still be frustrated, but we've done this already multiple times and it's getting old at this point. Nadia and Quinn is a storyline that I don't necessarily love either. She gets with Quinn, she works at the strip club and so forth, and he tries to protect her and all that, and it's okay. I mean, it's a side plot, so it doesn't have to be the best, but that relationship, you have Quinn coming off of his relationship with Deb and just moving on to Nadia, and I'm not a big fan of it. It's kind of boring to me as well, so not much there. I would say the ending of season 7 is interesting, where you have LaGuerta who's catching on, she's going back and going through Dokes' old stuff. She realizes Dexter is the Bay Harbor Butcher, and you ultimately have the culmination of Deb showing up to her and Dexter in the storage container, and Deb makes the choice to take out LaGuerta and spare Dexter, and they go off and back to the party to just blend in there. So LaGuerta and Isaac Sirko is what carries season 7, but that's decent. Just a lot of the in-between stuff can get boring, and a lot of the side plots I don't necessarily think adds a lot of value to the story overall. So season 7, I could see it either way. I'm gonna put it in Still Alive. I'm gonna put it behind season 5, but I could see you putting it in front of it. So I'm gonna put it behind it, but they're close enough, similar to Bloody Good Time with 2 and 1, that you could flip-flop them and I wouldn't argue too heavily either way. So moving on to season 8. So this is the one that most people hate the most, and from what I've seen online at least. So you have, once again, Deb kind of spiraling. You have the introduction of Sean Patrick Flannery, who plays Elway, who is a PI that she works for. And you have other characters as well, the inclusion, and some of them great, some of them not so great. So Elway, I would say, he's kind of annoying, but I like the actor of Sean Patrick Flannery, so I view that as mostly a pro. And then the other pro I would say is the inclusion of Zach. At first it seemed like he was not a great character, but then he gets closer to Dexter and Dexter spares him, and it seems like he's going to teach him the code, all this kind of stuff. Similar to what we wind up getting with Harrison in New Blood. But then they kill off Zach. So, like, that's fine, I guess, but the one thing I was starting to like about season 8, you just reversed by taking him out. Maybe that's to make the big bad seem very formidable, but I was bummed when they took out that character because it was like right after him and Vogel had a mission they went on and it went well, and then you come back and you see Zach's dead. It's like, okay, well, cool. So I would say there's not a lot of pros to season 8, but those are ones that I would call out. I'm going to list quite a few cons. As I said, a lot of people give a lot of cons of this, but I'm probably more forgiving of this season than a lot of people just because there's parts, especially on rewatch. When I first watched this season, I hated it. I hated the ending. But upon most recently watching it a few years ago prior to New Blood, I actually didn't hate the ending as much as I did the first time. And I don't know if it's because I expected it, so I was preparing myself to not be let down by it. So it's possible rewatch changed that a little bit. But the cons for the season, Brain Surgeon is kind of a boring big bad. He wasn't that great. He didn't have much personality. You didn't know who he was until later. And then he was just kind of a weird guy, and that was about it. Other parts of the show, or of the season, that didn't make a whole lot of sense. You have Dexter kill the brain surgeon in front of the cops and claim self-defense. And it was a vicious death. And maybe you want to say everything going on with Deb and the hurricane is maybe why they overlooked it, but you get Angel and Quinn just like grilling him right after it happened, and he's just pretty much like, yeah, it was self-defense. And maybe it's because they're boys that they let him go, but Quinn just kind of looks like, yeah, self-defense, right? They let him go, which I'm fine with it, but is that realistic? If we're trying to go for realism in the show, it definitely stretched it because they probably would have been a little bit more aggressive with it, especially Batista. But I don't know. That alone, not a big deal, I guess. You have the Vogel retcon situation where you had Harry, who was Dexter's kind of leader or teacher of how to use the code and so forth. And for 7 seasons, we believed Harry created the code and created this way for Dexter to live and do things the way he does things, but do it in a productive way. And then you get that retconned entirely here. You have, oh, Vogel gave Harry the code to give to you. It's like, okay, we're doing one of these where, like, when you get so long into a franchise, eventually you start changing things just to make some new interesting storyline. And this wasn't an interesting storyline, and it kind of, I don't, like, retcons are fine sometimes, but it just feels like you shoehorned that in there and it wasn't true for 7 seasons. Like, if that was the vision all along, and I get that, you don't know how long a season or a show's gonna go on for, so you have to make tweaks, but that feel like that watered down Harry's importance or impact to Dexter when you're like, oh, he just was taught this code by somebody else and then he just passed it on. So didn't love that. Deb is annoying for a lot of this season again, and as I said, maybe that's realistic because she's experiencing her brother being not who she thought he was, and she's coping with that. She eventually comes to terms and she gets back to being less annoying later, but then we have her interaction with the brain surgeon where this didn't make sense too. Dexter suddenly spares him because he's turned over a new leaf, and it's like, okay, why would you leave that loose end? But then she goes in, gets shot by him, and goes into surgery. She's got to be doing fine, and then they ultimately kill her off screen, which I'll sound like a dead horse with this one, but you have that maybe being realistic because that happens to people, but is that interesting to watch? Especially for a main character. I mean, other than Dexter, Deb's probably number 2 as far as important characters in the show. That felt not really earned, so that was kind of a bummer. And then the thing people talk about a lot, the hurricane, I didn't mind him like carrying her off in there because he feels like he lost everything and he was gonna give up. You have him survive it somehow and become a lumberjack. I didn't mind the lumberjack thing once again because he's like isolating himself because he realizes he causes harm everywhere he goes. Makes sense. Probably could have done that a better way than driving his boat into a hurricane. Like, how did he survive the hurricane? If you had him isolate himself some other way or something else, some other ending, the hurricane part is what I personally feel like is unrealistic and didn't love. But as I said, when I first watched it, I didn't like it at all. Upon rewatching a few years ago, I didn't mind it as much. It was fine. The hurricane thing's still absurd, but I didn't mind him choosing to separate himself and him thinking he was going to die and trying to take his sister out and pretty much go out with her. Overall, I think a lot of people, as I said, put this at the bottom of their list. I'm going to surprise you a little bit because of some of the parts that I do like about it, despite the long list of cons I probably just named. I'm going to put this in Backstabbed. I think there's a lot more that I dislike about season 8 than season 6, but season 6 just bores me for most of it. There's so much like setup with the whole, we have to do this ritual thing of this religious cult, and a lot of that's just boring. So I feel like season 8 has a lot of bad parts, but sometimes bad is better than boring to me because it's at least you're entertained by it in some way. So I'm gonna put this personally in Backstabbed. That's just my personal list. And then finally New Blood. So this is the one I watched most recently. This is the only one I've only watched one time, so haven't done a rewatch of New Blood just because of how I felt after watching it the first time. Obviously, and you've seen some of my videos, they're coming back. They're probably retconning the ending of New Blood. We'll find out how that works out, but I'm gonna be viewing this and rating this based off of how New Blood ended and the intended way it would end. Maybe in the future I will manipulate that, but we're gonna assume New Blood was the end of Dexter because that's what it was intended to be. So the pros to New Blood, you have Dexter back, new environment. I didn't love the New York scene as much as Miami, but he had to go somewhere else, so fine to throw him somewhere else. And once again, it's more Dexter. It's many years later. People that like the franchise want him in any capacity, so you were going into it with just a high of, I want to watch more of him. And other pros, I would say Clancy Brown is Kurt Caldwell, so the big bad of this season. I liked him. He had a reasonable situation. I don't know how he wouldn't have gotten caught this whole time, but realism, that's honestly, compared to season 8 and all the other seasons, realism goes out the window the most with this season, it feels like. The final pro of New Blood is Angel Batista. So he's the only inclusion of a prior character other than Dexter, unless you want to count Deb, who's playing the Harry role, the father figure. She's doing the I'm the ghost, I'm talking to you, which I did like at first. because they found a way to include Deb again. Obviously she died, you couldn't bring her back, but you found a way to include her again. But after like the first episode, I didn't like her at all. She just was constantly yelling at Dexter, and I realized that's his like mental state of criticizing himself and so forth. So while that may be what he's thinking, it wasn't great to watch. I'd rather her be even keel and just providing insight to him and not just yelling at him all the time and so forth. So she was a little bit, it got old having that aspect. Another con would be Harrison overall. I liked them bringing him back in the picture. I was curious to see how they would be involved, how the relationship would be there, what happened to Hannah, which they kind of just kill her off screen, I think the cancer, so okay. But over time, Harrison got a little bit annoying too. He had a similar aspect to Hannah and Deb, where it's just, you could have had something good here, but you're doing the same thing over and over. You're just beating up your dad because he left you, and just, that's not fun to watch all the time. Another big con, Angela is unbelievable. So she's dating Dexter, they're together, and then she just starts putting two and two together all over who he is out of nowhere. I know you've probably heard other people go on deep rants about it, so I won't stretch too long, but she goes and meets Angel coincidentally at this convention in New York, and Angel's like who he knew Dexter, and they were like best buds. He like told him about his wedding and so forth, and his sister watched Harrison, and you have them interact, and then you get Angel being like, oh yeah, what was the kid's name? Harrison. And it's just like, dude, you're playing that up too much. Like, that's not realistic. You would have known the kid's name in 2 seconds. A, that, but then B, why would Angela care at all about this kid's name? Like, it's only impactful if you know that she knows Dexter, but he doesn't know that. So I don't get it. I don't get why, I've seen this mentioned before, I don't get why you had the podcaster who was like all over these serial killers. Why didn't you have her bring up that to Angela? It's like, hey, that's Dexter. You know, he's the husband of Rita who got murdered by Trinity. Or like she would have seen pictures of him. Like there could have been so many things that would have made way more sense. Like, hey, he's the Bay Harbor Butcher. Anything that involved her and involved Angela and the podcaster would have made way more sense than Angela running into Batista randomly at a convention and then figuring things out. And then you get Harrison saying, oh, my dad's name's not even Jim, it's Dexter, and like, or whatever he winds up saying. Like his dad's name's not Jim. It's just like, okay, well, it's convenient that all those things happened at one time, which, all right. And then they do the whole M99 ketamine switch where he always used M99 in the original show, and they say ketamine's what he'd been using the whole time. It's like, dude, that's not true. And how do you not know that as the writers of the show? But we chose to go along with that because, I don't know, I think Michael C. Hall has a song called Ketamine, so somehow they wanted to include that. I don't really know the logic behind what they did there, but they had to fake out with the billionaire. It's like, dude, we knew Clancy Brown was Kurt Caldwell. He was the big bad of the season. He's like the surprise guest appearance. He's going to be the big bad. Why did you have this billionaire? And then you just take him out the show. Like, a lot of small decisions and big decisions were just poorly done. You have Dexter go crazy, and I heard one thing that mentioned, oh, he didn't actually shoot the cop. He just fell and the gun fired. It's like, why would you not have shown that more clearly if that was your intention? Because it definitely looks like Dexter shot him. All of that. So all of these small loopholes that were problems that I would have been okay with, but then you have the ending where he just is like, Harrison, shoot me. And he does, because Harrison shoots him because he killed his coach, who was like the white knight, the shining example throughout the entire season. The only like character development that the coach and the slash cop had in the show was he was a good person. So you had Dexter kill him, and then Harrison be like, oh, you are a bad person. So the second to last episode was like a really good way to almost end things. You had them take out Kurt Caldwell. They're working together. They're understanding one another. But then you have the last episode, and most of that's okay. It's still like Angela's got the screws and like all kinds of stuff that feels like I don't love. But then you're going to get the showdown by, she calls Angel and he's going to show up, and then we just have Harrison shoot Dexter, and then Angela shows up and says, hey, Harrison, here's $20 to get out of town. I'll cover for you. And it's just like, what kind of rushed ending was that? I think I had seen before that they maybe filmed the ending first, but even if that's the case, that's the ending you went with. A lot of people expected this to be one season, but I feel like doing like New Blood and introducing new characters and so forth, you're going to do that in just one season and just end it. And that was the whole plan. You didn't have like a backup plan to say, hey, people are really going to like this. Let's continue this. And they chose to just end it. And then now we're surprised that people really liked it. And now we're bringing it back and retconning Dexter's death potentially. But I hated the ending. And honestly, I rewatched Dexter a whole lot. And the way New Blood ended, I have been reluctant to rewatch it just because when you know how it ends, you're just like, why do I go through the whole story? I haven't watched Game of Thrones, but I've seen people talk about that where it's, oh, the last episode is awful, so everything you've done up to this point is now worthless. So that's how I felt a little bit with Dexter. I haven't gone and rewatched it since New Blood's ending. Maybe I'll rewatch it again, especially with now the new seasons coming out. We'll have to see how that goes. But overall, I know that was a bit long-winded on New Blood. I disliked a lot of aspects, especially the ending. If you did a better ending, it could have dramatically changed this season as far as how it falls on here. But with the original ending, with Dexter dying the way he did, and not having this new show yet, and not having the new show be part of what they planned, I'm putting New Blood in Honest Table behind 6. So 6 is extremely boring to me. New Blood is angry, like it angers me. And I don't know, it's just, the way they ended New Blood just was not great in my opinion. So I would say, as mentioned, a lot of people think season 8's the worst. Season 8 is the most absurd, but there's enjoyable parts to watch. Season 6 is extremely boring. New Blood is just, as I said, it angers me. It makes me so frustrated with that's the direction they went with. So that's why that one's last for me. You may really like New Blood. You may like season 6. You may hate season 3. As I said, this is just my overall viewpoint of things based off my most recent viewing. If I watch these again, I may change my opinion. I think people should be allowed to have fluctuating viewpoints of things just because your perspective changes, you watch it differently and so forth. So this is my list for now. What do you guys think? As I said, share your thoughts on where you'd rank things, and we'd love to see your viewpoint of everything down below. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope to talk to you again soon.